some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacture are afraid of somebody, are afraid of something. They know that there's a power somewhere, so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. Welcome to Geopolitics Demystified. I'm your host, S.L. Canthan. We bring in perspectives you do not see or hear in the mainstream media. The words you just heard are not of a conspiracy theorist, but a U.S. president, Woodrow Wilson. His description sounds like a totalitarian oligarchy, not a democracy. Abraham Lincoln had the best definition for democracy: of the people, by the people, for the people. But the reality of America was described by another American, a Nobel Prize winner and the former chief economist of the World Bank, Joseph Stiglitz. He wrote an entire article claiming and proving that the US is run of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. That sounds like a plutocracy. Then there are corporations, and they are giant these days. Just the S&P 500 companies alone have $16 trillion of revenue, and they spend billions of dollars every year on lobbying, which is legalized bribing. And all the government agencies are controlled by corporations through former employees. Thus, the FDA is controlled by Big Pharma. SEC is controlled by Wall Street. Pentagon is controlled by weapons manufacturers, and so on. The smooth revolving door makes it a lucrative business. Thus, in reality, the so-called American democracy is a mix of oligarchy, plutocracy, and corporatocracy. This is shocking considering that the US has defined itself in terms of being democratic. All the American wars are sold to the world as noble wars to spread freedom and democracy. American foreign policy is based on dividing the world into democracy versus autocracy. And numerous Western institutions spend a lot of time judging and ranking nations around the world on how democratic and free they are. By the way, saying that the US is not a democracy is not just a subjective claim. This is a scientific fact. A decade ago, two professors from the Princeton University did a detailed study on 25 years of legislation by US Congress. This is what they found. Business interests and economic elites have substantial impacts on US government policy, while average citizens have little or no influence. When most of the elites support a policy, they get it 45% of the time. However, regardless of how many regular Americans support a policy, they have close to 0% chance of getting what they want if the policy goes against the interests of the elites. In summary, the rich often win, but they never lose. Some good examples would be minimum wage, cost of housing, healthcare, and education, perpetual wars, etc. Another similar study demonstrated the truth about American political system, and you can see this in this chart. You can see that the US is actually worse than an oligarchy. Americans have lesser influence than they would in a theoretical oligarchy. This is depressing. But why do not Americans and the world see this trickery? Well, because of sophisticated propaganda and clever Hollywood-style drama known as the elections. This year, the US candidates will spend a whopping $10 billion to get elected. That kind of money gets you the most exciting reality show in the world. But here's a thought experiment. Do you know what would happen if Americans boycott all the elections? That is, if not a single American votes. Nothing. Life will go on as usual. The oligarchs and plutocrats will select their preferred puppets, and the US will carry on. Anyways, that's what really happens. That is, the elites select the candidates and let the masses vote. Moreover, what do elections really mean? Can the average American call up any politician from his district or the state to discuss some concerns? Of course not. However, if the same voter gives, say, $10,000 to that politician, a meeting will be quickly arranged. And if a person donates $1 million, he can not only have a nice dinner with that politician, but can even get appointed as an ambassador to some country. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This is exactly how the US politics works. Most Americans may not understand all the nuances of the deception, but they know something is wrong. That is why a majority of Americans do not even vote in the elections to choose the president, Congress, and governors. And according to Pew Research poll, a stunning 85% of Americans say that elected officials do not care about people like me. Here's a chart. And the US Congress, which is full of sanctimonious people who love waging wars to spread democracy, have an approval rating of not even 20%. More than 2 in 3 Americans disapprove of US Congress. Look at this chart. And if you use the broad word government, only 40% of Americans have trust in their system. This is from the Edelman Trust Barometer. Interestingly, India comes in at 76%, China comes in at 85%, and Saudi Arabia tops the list at 86%. Here's a chart. But if you think that US politicians give a damn about these polls, you would be shocked to know that more than 90% of congressmen get reelected. Whoa, how is that possible? Look at the chart. In fact, 2 years ago, 100% of US senators got reelected. This is the magic of the American system. Look at the chart. What is the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over, but expecting different results. Thus, the American system is insane. This happens because the country is deeply polarized and divided into red and blue districts. The red districts always vote for a Republican, and the blue ones always vote for a Democrat. Within this system, the politician can keep winning as long as he, number one, keeps his fellow 1% happy by supporting whatever policies they want, and number two, gets some money every year for pork barrel projects for his district. After all, the US federal government spends $7 trillion a year, so it's easy to sneak in a few special projects in the spending bill, which runs for more than 1,000 pages. For example, it could be something as simple as $1 million to renovate an LGBTQ community center, or $5 billion to build a tunnel in Boston. The Boston Tunnel was originally estimated to cost $3 billion, but ended up costing 5 times more and took over 20 years. So why cannot honest people run for office? Because it's impossible in the two-party system that is run by DNC and RNC, two corrupt organizations controlled by oligarchs, plutocrats, and corporations. These gatekeepers' job is to screen the candidates and eliminate anyone who wants to rock the boat. There's a reason that almost all the politicians in the Capitol Hill are millionaires. They don't need much convincing to help their fellow plutocrats. This rigged system has also raised colossal barriers to prevent the rise of any third-party candidate. It takes millions of dollars just to get on the ballot system. And then the candidate will be completely ignored by the mainstream media. Only the establishment candidates will get interviewed by TV stations. They'll have the opportunity to be on debate and get endorsed by the print media. If the maverick candidate gets a bit too popular, the mainstream media, which is part of the corporate network that rules America, will demonize that candidate and destroy his or her chances. There have been only a handful of virtuous candidates, like, say, Ron Paul. The system just tolerated him since he could not do much damage. However, the system is so totalitarian now that we will not see anyone like that anymore. Only a billionaire has any chance to compete in this system at a national level. The US had such a candidate in the 1992 presidential election when Ross Perot won almost 20% of the popular vote, but he couldn't win a single state. This year, Robert Kennedy Jr., a very decent guy, is running, but he will end up with perhaps 5% of the popular vote and thus will make no difference in the big picture. Here's another not so secret fact. The ruling elites pick their winner of each party and the election 1 or 2 years before the people get to vote. The rest is all just orchestrated contests like the WWE. In the DNC, they have superdelegates who have the veto power to override any candidate who might win the primaries during the presidential race. WikiLeaks emails showed how Hillary Clinton was decided as the winner in 2015, 1.5 years before the election. Bernie Sanders was just controlled opposition to fool the young people. Trump is definitely an oddball who fooled the RNC and became the president. He did not fit the mold of the establishment. That's why he was a one-time president. And that's why they tried to assassinate him and are even now trying to cover it up on social media and search engines. President JFK was assassinated because he challenged the deep state or the permanent government that President Woodrow Wilson talked about. Remember the quote in the beginning of this podcast? Similarly, other US presidents like Lincoln and Andrew Jackson faced assassination attempts because they refused to bow down to the banking and certain industrial class. How is that for a democracy? Are the elections themselves rigged by tampering with the voting machines? That's anyone's guess. But the US mainstream media once had documentaries about how easy it was to hack the voting machines. In 2016, there was hysteria about Russian interference. But in 2020, that logic changed. The US elections became sacred and nobody could question them. However, if Trump wins this year, the logic will be reversed again, and the US elections will once again become vulnerable to hacking. The brain hurts trying to keep up with the American absurdity. It's even hard to figure out what's the difference between Democrats and Republicans anymore. They're just two wings of the same imperialist oligarchic bird. Or as George Galloway says, two cheeks of the same ass. The two parties vehemently fight culture wars, and even that is fake, since Republicans have eventually surrendered in every cultural issue over the last several decades. Similarly, Democrats used to be the champion of workers, but now they are as pro-corporations, pro-Wall Street, pro-Big Pharma, and pro-wars as the Republicans. Consider that the real federal minimum wage in 2022 was 40% less than what it was in 1968. Shocking. By the way, real means adjusted for inflation. Look at the chart. But the Democrats have no solution for this. Instead, they worry about if a schoolboy who thinks he's a girl should be able to use the girl's bathroom. Wealth inequality in America. Life is quite bad in America, unless you're in the top 10% who own 90% of the stock market and 75% of the wealth. Look at these two charts. Consider another mind-boggling wealth inequality fact in the greatest country. The top 1% now own more wealth than the entire middle class. Vote Democrats, vote Republicans, rinse, repeat. Your life ain't gonna change unless you're in the top 1%. Look at this chart. Yet, most Americans are brainwashed to celebrate the performance of the stock market or how the US GDP is number one in the world. Conservatives and libertarians are told that talking about equality is a sign of socialism or communism. And if you work hard, you can be in the top 10% and then laugh at the bottom 90%. Democrats are told to worry about the endless social engineering revolution. Every few years, there will be a new cause to fight for. Of course, those causes for virtue signaling will do nothing to improve their wages, bank balance, or the standard of living. All of this is possible due to extraordinary propaganda and censorship. The media, academia, business leaders, etc., work 24/7 to maintain the illusion of democracy. To summarize the political system in America, let's listen to Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World. He said, the perfect dictatorship would have the appearance of a democracy, but would basically be a prison without walls in which the prisoners would not even dream of escaping. How appropriate. Foreign policy. The British imperialism had a slogan, King, Faith, and Empire. The US imperialism modernized that slogan to freedom and democracy. However, if the US does not have democracy at home, how the heck would it spread it abroad? Of course it does not. The US arms, funds, and supports 70% of the dictators around the world. It's easy that way. Other countries which have elections are good as long as they get to choose between two pro-US candidates. Vassals like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Germany are controlled to be 100% pro-US. In these countries, you will never see any politician or even the media challenge the American empire. During the Cold War, any leader who was against American exploitation was immediately labeled a communist, which means he could be overthrown or even assassinated. This happened many times in Latin America and sometimes in Asia. Now, a similar leader would be called a dictator, autocrat, etc., and would face calls for regime change. The US never accepts democratic elections in other countries if the outcome does not favor the US. The recent elections in Venezuela are a great example. Similarly, in Russia, however popular Putin is, the US acts as if he's a dictator. For example, the Wikipedia page for Putin does not even mention him winning any elections after 2012. In Ukraine, the US organized a neo-Nazi mob and overthrew a democratically elected leader in 2014. And if the people of Crimea overwhelmingly voted to join Russia, the US would not accept the results. In Syria, when Assad refused to be a vassal, the US colluded with other countries in the region and sent 100,000 Islamist jihadists into Syria and wrecked that country. There are countless examples of such American imperialism crushing real democracy around the world. US history. By the way, the US has hated democracy from the beginning. First, genocide of the natives and slavery of Africans laid the foundations of the US, not quite the embodiment of democracy, freedom, and human rights. In the first US election, George Washington got only 28,000 votes, although the population of the newly formed USA was 3 million. That is less than 1% of the population. Why? Because you had to be a white landowning male to vote. In some states, they didn't even have a popular election. Instead, the state legislatures chose the electors who would then voted for the president. The founders of America were always afraid of populism and the rule of the mob. That's why they had in place all sorts of checks and balances. And the word democracy does not even show up in the US Constitution. Having only 1/3 of the Senate run for elections in a given year was an insurance policy against populism. Similarly, if the people got carried away and voted for a radical populist president, then the Electoral College could ignore the popular vote and choose another president, another person to be the president. And of course, a handful of unelected judges in the US Supreme Court can overturn pretty much any law or referendum. Conclusion. The US elites have mastered the democracy propaganda to fool the world and their own population. Yes, pure democracy is impossible, and thus a representative democracy is needed. However, there must be accountability to make sure that the politicians meet the needs of most people. Without that, the system turns into neo-feudalism, which is what the US has now. US politicians represent only banks, corporations, and oligarchs, not the American people. Elections alone do not change anything. As someone once said, if voting changed anything, they would make it illegal. Look at China, where they don't have popular elections, but 90% of the people are happy with the central government. In Beijing, which is run by highly skilled people who don't need empty slogans and endless campaigns. In China, there's surprisingly a lot of responsiveness. For example, a Chinese person can dial 12345, talk to a live person within 15 seconds, and file a complaint about anything from potholes in the road to a malfunctioning air conditioner in a public library. The Chinese politicians are rated and promoted based on their ability to fix such problems. Is that not democracy? The US system, with a procedural democracy, has deep structural problems which, if not fixed, can lead to a civil war. The next decade will be very consequential and will reveal if the American system is resilient and can survive the upheavals that will accompany the multipolar world. The end. Thanks, and please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Bye for now.